They said the king had gone mad. They said he was tearing the kingdom apart, looking for a ghost. Celine touched the faint, silvery scar that curled over her hip like a sleeping serpent, and knew the truth. The king wasn't mad. He was broken. And she was the missing piece. 6 years ago, she had fled into the deep woods with a secret in her heart and another growing in her belly, leaving behind a world of stone, steel, and a betrayal that had ripped her soul in two. "Mama?" a small voice chirped, pulling her from the mire of memory. Torin, her son, her world, stood in the doorway of their small cottage, his small wooden wolf clutched in one hand. His eyes, the exact shade of molten gold as his father's, were wide with concern. At 6 years old, he was already preternaturally aware of her moods, the silent storms that raged behind her quiet exterior. He was the living, breathing proof of a love the world had been told never existed. "I'm here, my little wolf," Celine murmured, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She knelt and brushed a stray lock of dark hair from his forehead. "Just thinking." "About the sad things?" he asked, his brow furrowed. Celine's heart clenched. "Sometimes. But then I look at you, and the sad things get smaller." She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his hair, breathing in the scent of pine needles and boyish mischief. He was her anchor. He was the reason she endured the constant, hollow ache in her chest, the phantom burn of the mating mark on her hip that flared with a lonely fire in the dead of night. It was a bond that had been declared void, a connection forcibly severed, yet it stubbornly refused to die. The memory was a shard of glass in her mind, still sharp after all these years. The great hall of the Blackwood Keep, choked with the scents of pine, roasting meat, and the electric tension of 1,000 shifters packed shoulder to shoulder. She had been hiding in the alcoves, a servant girl, the daughter of the king's beta, Brennan. But she was more than that. She was Alaric's secret, his intended, his true mate, discovered one moonlit night in the royal gardens. They had met in secret for months, their bond a vibrant, living thing that promised a future of shared rule and unbreakable love. The mark on her hip had appeared after their first kiss, a searing silver brand that mirrored the one on his own. It was the moon goddess's seal, an undeniable truth. But on that night, the night of the formal announcement, everything had shattered. She watched from the shadows as King Alaric, his golden eyes clouded and distant, stood on the dais. He had looked right past her, his gaze empty. Then he had taken the hand of Lady Lysara Van Thorn, a woman of high birth and cold ambition, and declared her his chosen mate. A collective gasp had rippled through the hall. Celine felt the world tilt, the air rush from her lungs. The mark on her hip had exploded with a pain so blinding, so absolute, it had dropped her to her knees. It felt like her soul was being torn from her body. Through a haze of agony, she saw Lysada's triumphant, venomous smirk. It wasn't a look of love. It was a look of victory. Her father, Brennan, had found her, curled in on herself in the dark corridor, weeping. He was the only one who knew the truth of her bond with Alaric. His face, usually a mask of stoic loyalty, had been a canvas of fury and despair. "He doesn't know what he's doing," he had growled, his own wolf bristling with protective rage. "Something is wrong. His scent. It's tainted." But there was nothing he could do. The king had spoken. That night, Brennan had smuggled her out of the keep, away from the mocking whispers and Lysada's cruel gaze. 2 weeks later, hidden in a remote village, the morning sickness had begun. She was pregnant with the heir of a king who no longer remembered her name. Now, 6 years later, the ghost he hunted was her. The whispers that reached their secluded cottage on the tongues of traveling merchants were terrifying. King Alaric was a feral shadow of his former self. Prone to violent rages, he stalked the battlements of his castle, his howls of frustrated agony echoing through the valleys. The bond sickness, the healers called it, a madness that took hold when a mated wolf was forcibly separated from their other half. But no one knew who his mate was. Lysara wore the title of queen, but she wore it like a stolen cloak, and the land itself seemed to suffer under her cold, sterile rule. The harvests were thin, the winters harsher. The pack was on edge, leaderless in all but name. Selene stoked the fire in the hearth, the flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. She had made a life here, a simple, quiet life. But it was a life lived on a knife's edge. Every snapped twig, every unfamiliar scent on the wind sent a spike of fear through her. Lysara was not the kind of woman to leave loose ends. If she ever discovered that the servant girl Alaric had supposedly dallied with had borne him a son, a true-born alpha heir with the king's golden eyes, her wrath would be swift and merciless. Suddenly, the fine hairs on Selene's arms stood on end. A scent hit the air, cutting through the familiar aroma of wood smoke and damp earth. It was wolf. Not the familiar scent of the forest's wild packs. This was different, sharper, trained. And there was more than one. Torin felt it too. He froze, his little wooden toy dropping to the floor with a soft thud. He looked at his mother, his golden eyes wide with a fear that was far too old for his face. "Inside, now," Selene whispered, her voice tight. She shoved Torin toward the small root cellar hidden beneath a loose floorboard. "Stay there. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." "Do you understand me, Torin?" He nodded, his lower lip trembling, but he obeyed without question. He knew the drill. They had practiced it 100 times. As the heavy floorboard settled back into place, Selene grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. This was it. After 6 years of hiding, they had been found. The hunters had finally come for her son. The cottage door didn't just open. It exploded inward, ripped from its hinges by a force of raw, brutal strength. But the figure framed in the doorway was not one of Lysara's assassins. It was a man she knew better than her own reflection, yet hadn't seen in 6 long years. He was older, his hair more silver at the temples, his face etched with lines of grief and weariness she had put there. But his eyes, a fierce, loyal grey, were the same. "Brennan?" she breathed, the poker slipping from her nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. Her father stumbled into the room, his armor dented, a bloody gash across his forehead. He was no longer the king's beta. Lysara had seen to that, stripping him of his rank and exiling him from the court shortly after Selene's disappearance, branding him a traitor for questioning the king's choice. For 6 years he had been a wanderer, searching. "Selene," he gasped, his voice rough with emotion. He crossed the small room in 2 strides and pulled her into a crushing hug. For a moment she was a child again, safe in her father's arms. But the safety was an illusion. The scent of other wolves still clung to the air, closer now. "They're coming," Brennan rasped, pulling back to grip her shoulders, his eyes wild with urgency. "I was followed. Assassins. Lysara's dogs. They know. I don't know how, but they know about the boy." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Selene. "Torin," she whispered, her gaze darting to the floorboards. "I'll hold them off," Brennan said, drawing his sword. The steel sang softly in the firelight. "You take the boy and run. There is a hidden path behind the waterfall. Follow the creek north. Don't stop." He was the old soldier, the loyal protector, ready to give his life for his family. Before she could argue, a crossbow bolt whistled through the shattered doorway and buried itself in the wall just inches from her head. Brennan roared, a sound that was more wolf than man, and charged outside. Selene didn't hesitate. She ripped up the floorboard, her hands shaking. "Come on, little wolf, we have to go," she urged, pulling a terrified Tauren from the cellar. He clung to her, burying his face in her tunic. Outside, the sounds of battle erupted, the clash of steel, the guttural snarls of shifting men. She could hear her father fighting with the desperate fury of a cornered wolf, but he was outnumbered. A pained cry tore through the air, his cry, and Selene's blood ran cold. She slung Tauren onto her back, his small arms wrapping tightly around her neck. "Hold on," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. She scrambled out the back window of the cottage, landing softly on the damp moss outside. The roar of the nearby waterfall was a welcome thunder, promising to mask their escape. She ran, her bare feet finding purchase on the familiar forest floor. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Meanwhile, in the Blackwood Keep, 100 leagues away, King Alaric awoke with a scream. He thrashed in his silken sheets, his body drenched in sweat. The bond sickness was a relentless tormentor. It was a fire in his veins, a hollow void in his chest where his soul should be. He felt a phantom agony, not his own, a terror that flooded his senses and choked him. It was her, the ghost, the nameless, faceless woman who haunted his every waking moment and ruled his dreams. For 6 years he had been adrift in a fog of confusion and rage, his memories of the months before his mating to Lysara a frustrating blur. He remembered a scent of night-blooming jasmine and rain, a laugh like wind chimes, the feel of a soft hand in his. But he could not conjure a face. Lysara, his supposed queen, offered no comfort. She watched his madness with a cool, calculating patience, consolidating her power while he disintegrated. She would whisper poison in his ear, telling him the ghost was a symptom of his grief over a past lover who had died, a lie he almost believed in his weakest moments. But his wolf knew better. His wolf clawed at the cage of his ribs, desperate to run, to hunt, to find the other half of its soul. Tonight, the feeling was different. It wasn't the dull ache of loneliness. It was the sharp, stabbing certainty of imminent danger. His mate was in danger. The psychic scream of her terror cut through the wolfsbane-induced fog in his mind with the clarity of a lightning strike. His pup was in danger. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a primal knowledge that bypassed his broken memory entirely. A pup. He had a pup. A guttural roar of pure, undiluted alpha fury tore from his throat, shaking the very foundations of the stone castle. The guards outside his chambers scrambled back in fear. This was not the king's usual anguish. This was something new, something lethal. Lysara entered his chambers, her face a mask of feigned concern. "Alaric, my love, what is it? Another nightmare?" she cooed, reaching for him. He slapped her hand away, his golden eyes blazing with a lucidity she had not seen in years. "You," he snarled, the sound vibrating with killing intent. He could suddenly smell the lie on her, the faint, cloying undertone of wolfsbane and deceit that clung to her like a cheap perfume. The fog was gone. The poison's hold, shattered by the force of his mate's terror, had receded, and 6 years of fragmented memories slammed back into place. Selene. Her face, her scent, her name. It was all there. And the memory of the great hall, of his own voice betraying her, of the agony on her face as she crumpled in the shadows. "What did you do?" he roared, advancing on her. Lysara's composure finally broke. Fear flashed in her eyes. "I did what was necessary. For the pack. For our status. She was a nobody, a servant. I am a Van Thorn. You belong with me." "I belong to my mate," he growled, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "And you sent hunters after her." It wasn't a question. He knew it in his bones. He knew it with the same certainty that he knew his own name. He didn't wait for an answer. His only focus was the thread of terror pulling him, a psychic tether that stretched across the kingdom, leading him to her, to them. He didn't bother with the door. With a roar that blended human rage and wolfish power, he launched himself through the stone wall of his chambers, shattering rock and mortar as if it were glass. He landed in the courtyard below, his body already twisting and breaking, bones snapping and reforming in the violent, beautiful agony of the shift. Where the king had stood, a wolf now towered. He was a beast of nightmare, larger than any wolf the pack had ever seen, his fur the color of polished jet, his eyes burning with the molten gold of a dying star. He was no longer the mad king. He was the feral alpha, and he was going to war. He threw his head back and howled, a promise of salvation and the declaration of vengeance that was heard for miles. Then he ran, a black streak of pure power, tearing the world apart to get to his family. Celine scrambled through the undergrowth, branches whipping at her face, thorns tearing at her clothes. Torin's weight was a comforting pressure on her back, his small, frightened breaths puffing against her neck. Behind them, the sounds of fighting had stopped. A chilling silence had fallen, more terrifying than the clash of swords. She knew what it meant. Her father had fallen. Grief, sharp and hot, threatened to buckle her knees, but she couldn't stop. She had to honor his sacrifice. She had to get Torin to safety. She reached the clearing with the waterfall, its roar a deafening curtain of sound. The hidden path was just beyond it, a narrow ledge concealed by mist and ferns. They were almost there. Hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, fluttered in her chest. It was extinguished in an instant. 3 figures stepped out from behind the rocks, blocking her path. They were dressed in black leather, their faces hidden by grim, snarling wolf masks. They were Lysara's assassins. The lead assassin, a hulking brute of a man, held up a crossbow, the bolt tipped with a viscous, dark green substance. Poison. They weren't just here to kill, they were here to make it hurt. "Nowhere left to run, little mother," the leader sneered, his voice distorted by the mask. "The false queen sends her regards. She is very particular about tidying up loose ends, especially ones with golden eyes." Selene slowly slid Torin from her back, pushing him behind her. She stood between her son and the men who had come to murder him, her body a flimsy human shield. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, a weapon, anything. But there was nothing. Just rocks, water, and the 3 predators circling them. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but seeing the terror in her son's eyes ignited something else within her. A primal, maternal fury she hadn't known she possessed. She would not let them touch him. "You'll have to go through me," she said, a voice trembling but resolute. The assassin laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "That's the plan." He raised his crossbow, taking aim not at her, but at the small boy cowering behind her legs. Time seemed to slow down. Selene saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. She saw the glint of the poisoned tip. She heard Torin's terrified whimper. A scream built in her throat, a scream of absolute despair. She threw herself in front of her son, preparing for the impact, for the fire of the poison in her veins. The bolt never came. Instead, a sound ripped through the air that was not of this world. It was the sound of a hurricane tearing through a forest, the sound of an earthquake splitting the earth. A blur of black fury exploded from the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was the massive jet-black wolf. He moved faster than thought, a living shadow of death. He slammed into the lead assassin, and the man's cruel laugh turned into a wet, gurgling scream that was cut brutally short. The wolf's jaws, powerful enough to snap trees, closed around the man's neck, and the sound of breaking bone echoed in the sudden, shocked silence. The other two assassins were frozen for a heartbeat, their minds unable to process the sheer scale and ferocity of the beast before them. It was a monster from the old legends, an alpha of impossible size and power. That heartbeat was all the wolf needed. He dropped the first man's broken body and turned on the second, tearing through leather and flesh with claws like obsidian daggers. The third assassin, shaking with terror, managed to fire a wild shot that glanced off the wolf's thick hide before he turned and fled, screaming, back into the woods. The black wolf let him go. His priority was not the fleeing coward. His priority was in the clearing. The massive beast stood over the mangled bodies of the assassins, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his black muzzle. And then he turned. Those eyes, those terrifying, beautiful eyes of molten gold, fixed on her. Celine stood frozen, her arms protectively around Torin. She knew that wolf. She knew those eyes. Her soul knew them. Slowly, with a sound of grinding bone and tearing muscle that made her flinch, the giant wolf began to shrink. The black fur receded, the savage muzzle softened and reformed, the powerful lupine form folding in on itself until a man stood in its place. He was naked, covered in the blood of his enemies and the dust of a frantic, kingdom-spanning journey. His golden eyes, no longer burning with feral rage, were now wide with a dawning, desperate recognition. The fog was gone. He saw her. He truly saw her. "Celine," Alaric breathed, his voice raw, broken. It was a prayer, a plea, a name he had been screaming into the void for 6 years. The world seemed to hold its breath. The roar of the waterfall, the drip of blood, the chirping of birds, it all faded into a dull hum. All that existed was the space between them, charged with 6 years of pain, misunderstanding, and a bond that had refused to break. "Alaric," she whispered back, the name feeling foreign and yet intimately familiar on her tongue. He took a hesitant step toward her, then another. He looked from her face, a face he now remembered with perfect, agonizing clarity, down to the small boy clutching her leg. He saw the dark hair, so like Celine's, and the stubborn set of his jaw, so like his own. And then he saw his eyes, his own golden eyes, staring back at him from the face of a child, a son, his son. The Alpha King, the feral beast who had just torn 2 men apart without a thought, crumbled. He fell to his knees in the damp earth and mud of the clearing, his powerful body shaking with violent, racking sobs. The strength that had carried him across a kingdom, that had shattered stone and torn flesh, deserted him completely. All that was left was a man, broken and redeemed in the very same instant. "They told me you were gone," he wept, his voice thick with unspeakable grief. "They told me you had left, that you never... They lied. All of it. A lie." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for an impossible forgiveness. "I did not choose her," Alaric roared, the sound filled with self-loathing. "I would never choose anyone but you. I was drugged, poisoned. A wolf's bane compound, Marta the healer called it. It clouded my mind, stole my memories of you. I woke up 3 days after the ceremony screaming your name, but I couldn't see your face. I've been hunting a ghost, my own mate." Celine's heart, which had been a frozen stone in her chest for 6 years, began to thaw. The poison. It wasn't a rejection. It was an attack, a scheme. The agony of his betrayal was replaced by a wave of shared sorrow for the years that had been stolen from them. She took a tentative step toward him, pulling Torin with her. Alaric's gaze was fixed on the boy. His trembling hand, still stained with blood, hovered in the air between them. "May I?" he whispered, his voice cracking. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. The powerful king was asking her permission to acknowledge his own son. Selene nodded, her throat too tight for words. She gently nudged Torin forward. The boy, who had just witnessed unspeakable violence, showed no fear. He looked from the kneeling, weeping man to his mother, and then back again. He saw the same golden eyes as his own, and an ancient, instinctual knowledge seemed to pass through him. Alaric, slowly, reverently, reached out and placed his hand on Torin's small shoulder. The moment his skin made contact with his son's, a jolt, visible as a faint shimmer of golden light, passed between them. The mating mark on Selene's hip, the one that had been a source of cold pain for so long, flared with a sudden searing heat. Not of agony, but of pure, incandescent joy. The broken bond, the frayed and damaged tether between their souls, snapped taut, flooding her with Alaric's overwhelming relief, his profound love, his devastating regret. Two halves of a soul, separated by poison and lies, were beginning to stitch themselves back together. The Alpha King wept, his head bowed before the son he never knew he had. And in the heart of the wild woods, a family was finally reborn from the ashes of betrayal. For those who have followed the journey of this broken king and his hidden queen, who believe that a true bond can withstand even the most wicked poison and the vastness of time, this is a moment of profound reunion. The discovery of his son is the dawn after a long, dark night. If you feel the power of this fated moment, if you believe in love that can tear down kingdoms and rebuild them, then show your support. Smash that like button and subscribe for more tales of epic shifter romance where fate cannot be denied. Now, let us return to the forest, where a king must earn back his crown, and a mother must decide if she can trust the man who broke her world. The silence that followed Alaric's confession was thick with unspoken words. Selene watched him, this magnificent, shattered man kneeling in the mud, his hands still resting on their son's shoulder, as if Torin were the only thing anchoring him to the world. Torin, for his part, reached out a small, hesitant hand and patted Alaric's tear-streaked face. It was a gesture of simple, childish comfort that seemed to break the king all over again. "You have my eyes," Alaric whispered, his voice choked. He looked up at Selene, his own golden eyes swimming with 1,000 questions. 6 years, Selene. You were alone for 6 years. We were not alone, Selene corrected softly, her gaze dropping to Torin. We had each other. She finally moved, sinking to her knees in front of him, creating a small circle of 3 in the blood-soaked clearing. But it was hard. I thought you had cast me aside. I thought the bond meant nothing to you. It meant everything, Alaric insisted, his voice raw with sincerity. It was my life, even when I couldn't remember why. My wolf knew. It has been clawing its way out of my chest for 6 years, trying to find you. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. The contact was electric. The warmth of the reforming bond spread up her arm, chasing away the last of the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Lysara, that venomous, power-hungry viper, she will pay for this. She will pay for every tear you shed, for every day I lost with my son. His rage was a palpable thing, a heat that radiated from him, but it was no longer the wild, uncontrolled madness of before. It was focused, It was the calculated fury of a king who had found his purpose again. But before the king, there was the father and the mate. "What is his name?" Alaric asked, his voice soft again. "Torin," Selene replied. "Torin," Alaric repeated, testing the name on his tongue. He smiled, a true, brilliant smile that transformed his haggard face. "It's a strong name, a prince's name." He looked at his son, truly looked at him, and a new kind of light entered his eyes. Not just relief, but pride. Overwhelming, fierce, fatherly pride. A groan from the edge of the clearing shattered the moment. Brennan. Selene had forgotten him in the whirlwind of Alaric's arrival. She scrambled to her feet and ran to her father's side. He was slumped against a tree, his sword lying beside him. A deep, wicked gash ran down his side, bleeding profusely. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. "Father!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. She pressed her hands to the wound, but the blood flowed freely between her fingers. Alaric was there in a second, his protective presence a solid wall at her back. He assessed the wound with a practiced eye. "It's deep. He's lost too much blood. We need to get him back to the keep, to Marta." "Marta is a prisoner," Selene said, her voice tight with fear. "Lysara would have locked her away the moment she suspected her of knowing the truth about the poison." Brennan coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "She did," he rasped, his grey eyes struggling to focus. "Lysara holds her in the dungeons. Threatened to execute her for treason if I ever spoke of what I suspected." He looked past Selena to Alaric. "Your Majesty, you came back." A faint, weary smile touched his lips. "I knew you would." "Rest, old friend," Alaric said, his voice thick with gratitude and regret. "You protected them when I could not. I will not let you fall." He looked at Selena, a desperate hope in his eyes. "We have to do something. Now." Selena looked at her father, his lifeblood seeping into the earth. She looked at Alaric, his face a mask of grim determination. And she looked at Torin, who was watching with wide, frightened eyes. A fierce, protective instinct, stronger than anything she had ever felt, surged through her. She would not lose anyone else today. Without thinking, she closed her eyes and focused. She reached for the warmth that was blooming inside her, the heat from the newly reforged bond. But there was something else there, too. A deeper well of power. Something ancient and quiet that had lain dormant within her bloodline for generations. The Moon Mother's gift. She had felt whispers of it before. A cut that healed too quickly. A fever in Torin that broke the moment she touched him. She had always dismissed it as coincidence. Not anymore. She pressed her hands firmly against her father's wound, ignoring the sticky warmth of his blood. She channeled all her will, all her love for him, all her desperate need for him to live, into her palms. A soft, silvery light began to glow beneath her hands, pulsing with a gentle rhythm. It was the color of moonlight on water. Alaric and Brennan both gasped. The light grew brighter, seeping into the wound. Beneath her fingers, Selene could feel the torn tissues knitting themselves back together, the severed muscles weaving into one another. The bleeding slowed, then stopped completely. The ragged edges of the gash pulled closed, leaving behind only a thin pink line that was already beginning to fade. She pulled her hands away, breathing heavily. The effort had left her drained, but a glance at her father showed it had been worth it. The color was returning to his face, his breathing evening out. He stared at his side, then at his daughter, his eyes wide with utter disbelief and awe. "By the goddess," Brennan whispered, sitting up straighter. Celine, what was that? Alaric stared at her, not with fear, but with profound reverence. He had sensed a unique power in her from the moment they met, but he had never imagined this. She was not just his mate. She was something more, something sacred. Anchor magic, he breathed. Healing light. The old texts spoke of it, a power gifted only to the true queens, the mothers of the pack, who could anchor their people and heal their alpha. It was thought to be lost to time. Selene looked at her own hands, which had stopped glowing. She had never felt so powerful or so exhausted. The dormant magic, awakened by the combination of the bond's restoration and the threat to her family, hummed in her veins like a newly struck chord. "We don't have time to discuss this now," Alaric said, his focus snapping back to the present danger. He helped Brennan to his feet, steadying him. "Lysara thinks you are dead," he said to Selene. "She thinks her assassin succeeded. That is our advantage. We will travel under the cover of darkness and be at the gates of the keep by dawn." He turned to Brennan. "Can you travel?" Brennan squared his shoulders, the old soldier back in command of himself. The wound was gone, his strength returning with every breath. "I can run with the king," he stated, his voice firm. Alaric nodded, then looked at Selene and Torin. "It will be a hard journey." "We will manage," Selene said, her initial fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer the frightened girl hiding in the woods. She was a mother with a newly discovered power, and she was going to take back her son's birthright. The journey back to the Blackwood Keep was a blur of shadows and speed. Alaric, in his human form but moving with the tireless grace of his wolf, carried Torin, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against his father's chest. The sight of them together, the powerful king cradling the small boy so gently, sent a pang of bittersweet joy through Selene. This was how it should have been all along. She ran beside them, Brennan at her other side, a silent, formidable guard. They moved like ghosts through the night, a king, a queen, a prince, and their loyal guardian. A hidden royal family on a mission of reclamation. As they ran, Alaric spoke in a low voice, filling in the gaps of the last 6 years. He told her of Lysara's subtle manipulations, how she isolated him from his trusted advisors like Brennan, how she fed the Pack Council lies about his instability, consolidating her own political power. He spoke of the emptiness, the maddening search for a woman he couldn't name, the bond sickness that gnawed at his sanity. Listening to him, Selene's last vestiges of anger melted away, replaced by a shared sense of loss for the life they had been robbed of. "She will not see the dawn as queen," Alaric vowed, his voice a low growl that promised retribution. "When the pack sees you, when they see Torin, they will know the truth. A true alpha's heir cannot be faked, and a true bond cannot be denied." They arrived at the outskirts of the capital as the first hints of grey lightened the eastern sky. The Blackwood Keep loomed on its rocky precipice, a fortress of dark stone that looked more like a prison than a home. Alaric led them not to the main gate, but to a hidden postern gate set into the cliff face, a secret entrance known only to the royal line. Inside, the castle was eerily quiet. Lysara, confident in her assassin's success, would be sleeping soundly. But Alaric wasn't heading for her chambers. He was heading for the dungeons first. They moved through the silent stone corridors, their footsteps echoing like heartbeats. They found Marta the healer in a cold, damp cell, looking frail but unbroken. Her eyes widened in shock, first at the sight of Brennan, then of Alaric, and finally of Selene and the sleeping boy in the king's arms. "My king," she whispered, tears welling, "and my queen. The goddess has answered my prayers." Alaric broke the lock with a single contemptuous twist of his hands. "Marta, I am sorry I did not see the truth sooner," he said. "The poison was a potent blend, Your Majesty," Marta said, her healer's instincts taking over as she checked him for lingering effects. "Designed to sever memory and suppress the bond. Only a shock of immense power, the life of your mate or child being in mortal danger, could have broken its hold." She looked at Selene with knowing eyes. "And it seems it has awakened other things as well." Their reunion was cut short by the sound of the morning bells and the distant tramp of guards' boots. The castle was waking up. It was time. "Brennan, take Marta and Torring to the royal nursery," Alaric commanded. "Bar the door. Let no one enter." He handed his sleeping son over to the old beta, his expression softening for a moment. "Guard him with your life." "I already have, Your Majesty," Brennan replied, a grim smile on his face. He nodded to Selene, a look of immense pride in his eyes, before leading Marta and a still sleeping Torrin down a side corridor. Now it was just the two of them. Alaric turned to Selene, taking her hands in his. "Are you ready for this?" She looked down at her simple torn tunic and bare feet, then met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a fire that matched his. "I am not the girl who fled this castle 6 years ago," she said. "Let's go introduce the pack to their true queen." Together they walked toward the great hall, two halves of a soul made whole again, ready to reclaim their kingdom from the usurper who had tried to tear them apart. The final confrontation was at hand. The massive oak doors of the great hall were pushed open not with a whisper, but with a resounding crash that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. Every head in the hall, filled with the early morning assembly of the pack council and high-ranking members, snapped toward the entrance. A collective gasp swept through the room like a physical wave. There stood King Alaric, not the haggard, half-mad ruler they had grown accustomed to, but the Alpha they remembered from before. His golden eyes were clear and sharp, his posture radiating a lethal authority that had been absent for years. And beside him stood a woman with dark, flowing hair, eyes the color of the forest floor, and a quiet, unshakable dignity. She was dressed in the tattered remnants of a peasant's tunic, yet she wore it like a royal gown. It was Selene, the beta's daughter, the servant girl who had vanished without a trace 6 years ago. At the head of the hall, on the twin thrones of the Alpha pair, Lysara Van Thorn froze, a goblet of wine halfway to her lips. Her face, a carefully constructed mask of regal beauty, went slack with shock, then twisted into a snarl of disbelief and pure, undiluted fury. The ghost had come back, and she had brought the true king with her. "Alaric!" Lysara cried, her voice shrill. She stood, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger. "What is the meaning of this? And what is that servant girl doing here? Guards, seize her!" But the guards hesitated, their eyes darting between the cold, furious woman on the dais and the formidable presence of their Alpha king. Alaric took a step forward, his voice booming through the hall, laced with the command of a true Alpha. "Stand down." The guards immediately lowered their weapons, bowing their heads in submission. Lysara's face paled. She had lost control of them. She had lost control of him. "This woman," Alaric declared, placing a protective hand on Selene's back, "is Selene, daughter of Brennan. She is not a servant. She is my true mate, the one chosen for me by the goddess herself. She is your true queen." A shocked murmur erupted through the pack. They looked from Selene's glowing, healthy radiance to Lysara's cold, sterile beauty. They looked at Alaric, truly alive, for the first time in years. The bond sickness was gone. The pieces began to click into place. "Lies!" Lysara shrieked, her composure shattering completely. "He chose me. The bond was formalized. This is treason. She is a nobody, a pathetic creature who fled in the night because he did not want her." "I did not choose you," Alaric roared, the sound vibrating with 6 years of suppressed rage. "I was drugged, poisoned with a wolfsbane compound by this usurper, so she could steal a crown she did not earn." He pointed directly at Lysara. "She severed our bond, stole my memories, and left me in a living hell for more than half a decade, while she poisoned the pack with her ambition." Lysara's eyes darted around the room, seeing the dawning comprehension and disgust on the faces of the council members. She was cornered. A cornered wolf is the most dangerous. Her gaze fell upon a group of guards loyal to her family, the Van Thorn House Guard, who stood near the side of the hall. "You will believe this whore over your queen?" she screamed. "I have proof of her treachery. Bring the prisoners." At her command, her personal guards dragged 2 figures from a side chamber. It was Marta, the healer, and Brennan. And between them, held firmly by a brutish guard, was a small, terrified Taurin, now wide awake. Selene's breath caught in her throat. "Taurin!" Alaric let out a low growl, a promise of death. He had thought them safe. "Behold the proof," Lysara announced, her voice dripping with triumphant malice. "The product of her treason. A bastard child she claims is the king's. She and her traitor father conspired with the healer to create this lie, to usurp my throne." She was spinning a new narrative, a desperate, last-ditch effort to save herself. "That boy is no bastard." Alaric's voice was dangerously quiet. "He is my son, my true-born heir. Look at his eyes." All eyes in the hall turned to the boy. Even from across the vast room, they could see it. The unmistakable burning gold of the Alpha King's eyes stared back at them from the face of the child. It was undeniable proof. A gasp of wonder and realization swept the hall. This was no lie. This was the lost prince. Lysara saw she had lost. The pack would never follow her now. Her eyes, filled with a crazed hatred, fixed on the one thing that could still hurt them all. The one thing that could destroy Selene. "If I cannot have this kingdom," she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper, "then there will be no heir to inherit it." She nodded to the guard holding Taurin. "Kill the boy." It was her fatal mistake. She had threatened the child in front of the mother. The guard, a loyal Van Thorn dog, raised a dagger. Alaric roared and started to charge forward, but he was too far away. Brennan lunged, but was blocked by another guard. Everything happened in a flash. The glint of the descending blade, Taurin's scream of terror, and then Selene moved. But she didn't run. She stood her ground, threw her head back, and a sound of pure, unadulterated power ripped from her throat. It was not a human scream. It was something more. Pain exploded. Golden light, brilliant and blinding, flooded the room, emanating from Selene in a concussive wave that threw everyone, including Alaric, back a step. Her bones broke with a series of sickening cracks, but it was a sound of transformation, not injury. The light was so bright it was impossible to look at her directly. Where Selene had stood, a wolf now towered. But it was not just any wolf. This wolf was immense, as large as Alaric's own feral form, but her fur was the color of fresh fallen snow, so white it seemed to glow from within. Her eyes were not the amber of a normal wolf, but a startling fiery gold, burning with ancient magic and a mother's righteous fury. She was the white wolf of the legends, the Moon Mother incarnate, a being of power not seen in their world for 1,000 years.
She caught the dagger-wielding guard's arm, not with a paw, but with a clawed hand that was still halfway between wolf and human. The dagger clattered to the floor. With a snarl that shook the stone walls, she flung the guard across the room, where he crumpled against a pillar and did not move again. The great hall was plunged into a stunned, reverent silence. They were in the presence of a goddess. Lysara stared, her face a mask of abject terror, her mind finally breaking as she comprehended the scale of the power she had provoked. She had not just tried to usurp a queen, she had tried to murder the child of a deity. The white wolf that was Selene turned her head, her fiery golden eyes locking with Lysara's. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another, a predator closing in on her prey. Alaric, recovering from his shock, moved to stand beside her, his own wolf rising to the surface, ready to fight and die for the magnificent, terrifying creature that was his mate. The reclamation was no longer a matter of politics or succession. It was a matter of divine judgment. And judgment had come to the house of Van Thorn. Lysara, faced with the incandescent fury of the white wolf, finally broke. She scrambled backward, tripping over the hem of her own gown and falling in a heap at the base of the throne she had stolen.
"No,"
she whimpered, her haughty demeanor stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, terrified woman.
"Stay back! It's a monster!"
The pack, however, did not see a monster. They saw a miracle. They saw their salvation. One by one, the wolves in the great hall, from the lowest-ranking guard to the most powerful council members, fell to their knees. They bowed their heads not in fear, but in absolute, unconditional reverence. They were bowing to their true queen. The white wolf paused, her gaze sweeping over the kneeling pack. She looked at Alaric, who met her gaze with one of pure, unadulterated love and awe. She saw Brennan, who had managed to pull Torrin into a protective embrace, his face shining with tears of pride for the incredible woman his daughter had become. And she saw her son, his golden eyes wide not with fear of her, but with wonder. The immediate threat was over. With a visible effort of will, the blinding light around her softened. The massive white form began to recede, the process of shifting back gentler this time. When the light faded, Selene stood once more in her human form, exhausted and trembling but unharmed. A collective sigh of relief went through the hall. Alaric was at her side in an instant, wrapping his arms around her, supporting her. "I have you," he murmured into her hair. "My brave, magnificent queen." Her first thought was for her son. "Torrin," she breathed. Brennan brought the boy to her. Torrin ran the last few feet and threw his arms around his mother's legs. "He was so big, Mama," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Like a snow cloud with teeth." Selene knelt and hugged him tightly, burying her face in his hair, reassuring herself that he was safe, he was real. Over his head, her eyes met Alaric's, and a silent understanding passed between them. It was over. The fight was won. Now came the reckoning. Alaric turned his attention to Lysara, who was being hauled to her feet by two of his own royal guards. Her face was streaked with tears, her fine gown torn and dusty. "Lady Lysara Van Thorn," Alaric's voice was cold as iron. "You stand accused of high treason, of the poisoning of your king, of conspiracy to murder the queen and the royal heir. Before this council and your pack, how do you plead?" Lysara's eyes, wild and cornered, darted around the room, looking for any ally, any escape. She found none. Every face was turned to her with contempt. Her pride, the only thing she had left, curdled into venom. "Plead," she spat, laughing, a high, unhinged sound. "I plead guilty. I did it. I drugged your wine with a compound so potent it should have erased her from your mind forever. I would have been the perfect queen. This pack needs strength, a high-born lineage, not some magical freak and her whelp. I did what I had to do for power, and I would do it again." Her confession, screened in the ringing silence of the great hall, sealed her fate. The council members looked at each other, their expressions grim. There was only one punishment for such a crime. "Death," one of the elders pronounced, his voice heavy. Alaric looked at Selene. It was her right as the wronged party to confirm the sentence. But Selene looked at the pathetic, hate-filled woman and felt not vengeance, but a profound pity. "No," Selene said, her voice clear and strong. Every eye turned to her. "Death is too easy. It is an ending. She deserves to live with what she has done." She looked directly at Lysara. "You will be stripped of your name and your rank. The Van Thorn house will be dissolved, its lands forfeit to the crown. You will be exiled to the Wailing Peaks, the barren lands to the north. You valued status and power above all else. Now you will have neither. You will live out your days as a nobody, with nothing but the memory of what you tried to steal." It was a sentence far crueler than death. To a woman like Lysara, to be forgotten was a fate worse than any execution. A low murmur of approval went through the pack. It was a just sentence. It was a queen's sentence. As Lysara was dragged away, screaming curses and threats that no one listened to, Selene felt a wave of dizziness. The magical transformation had taken a toll. She stumbled, and Alaric caught her. At the same time, Brennan let out a low groan. In the chaos, no one had noticed that when he had lunged to protect Torin, one of Lysara's guards had managed to land a blow, reopening the wound on his side that Selene had healed. It wasn't as bad as before, but it was bleeding again. "Father!" Selene cried, rushing to him. "It's nothing, my girl," he grunted, but his face was pale. "It is not nothing," Selene insisted. She placed her hands over his side once more. The silvery light, weaker this time but still present, flowed from her palms. The pack watched in hushed awe as the wound sealed itself shut for a second time. She had saved him again. Her power was real. It was a gift to them all. With the last of the day's threats dealt with, a new energy filled the hall. An energy of hope and renewal. Alaric raised his voice once more. "The lies have been purged. The truth is known. My son, Prince Torin, is restored to his birthright. And my mate, Selene, has shown you all her true nature. She is not only your queen by bond, but a wielder of the ancient magic, a protector of this pack. She is the Moon Mother returned." He then did something that stunned the entire pack. He went down on one knee before Selene. The Alpha King knelt before his queen. "My bond with you is a truth in my soul," he said, his voice thick with emotion for all to hear. "But it was never formalized. It was stolen from us." He looked up at her, his golden eyes blazing with love. "Before our pack, before the goddess, I ask you to make it complete. Claim me, Selene. Make us whole." He bared his throat, an act of ultimate submission and trust from an alpha to his mate. Selene looked at this incredible man, her king, her other half, kneeling before her. She looked at their son, who was watching with a huge smile. She looked at her father, healed and whole. Her heart was so full it felt like it might burst. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and cupped his jaw. "Always," she whispered.
Leaning down, she sank her teeth gently into the junction of his neck and shoulder, right over his own mating mark. A jolt of pure energy, golden and silver light intertwined, erupted from the point of contact, washing over them both. It was not a bite of pain or possession, but of completion. The bond, reforged in crisis and now sealed by ceremony, settled into a state of perfect, unbreakable harmony. Two halves of a soul, torn asunder by malice, became one forever. Alaric rose, a look of pure bliss on his face. He gently tilted her head to the side and returned the bite, his own teeth sinking into the flesh over her silver mark. The circle was complete. He pulled her into a deep kiss as the entire great hall erupted in a deafening roar of celebration and joyous howls. Their king and queen were finally, truly united. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change and healing. Lysara was exiled as promised, a forgotten footnote in the pack's history. The pack council, ashamed of their blindness, pledged their unwavering fealty to their new queen, whose wisdom and power had already become a legend. Celine's coronation was not a somber, formal affair, but a joyous festival. She stood beside Alaric, Torrin between them, and accepted the crown not as a ruler, but as a mother to her people. One evening, weeks later, Celine stood on the balcony of their royal chambers, looking out over the moonlit kingdom. The land already seemed healthier, more vibrant, as if it were responding to the restoration of the true bond. Alaric came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about, my queen?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her back. "I was just thinking about a little cottage in the woods," she said softly, "and a lonely girl who was afraid of her own shadow." "That girl is gone," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "In her place is a queen who commands the moonlight, and a wolf who makes even alphas kneel." "I'm still that girl, in some ways," she admitted, "but I'm not lonely anymore, and I'm not afraid." A small figure padded out onto the balcony, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Mama? Papa?" Torrin asked, his voice drowsy. Selene smiled and turned, scooping him up into her arms. Alaric wrapped his arms around them both, creating a warm circle of family. Torrin snuggled between them, already half asleep again, secure in the love of his parents. They stood there for a long time, 3 points of light against the darkness, a family forged in betrayal, reforged in battle, and now, finally, at peace. The rejected girl had become a queen, the mad king had found his soul, and the lost prince had come home. Their future, like the kingdom spread out before them, was bright and full of promise. And that is how the rejected servant became the Alpha Queen. From a broken heart in a lonely cottage to a throne beside her fated king, Celine's story proves that you can't fight fate, and that the power of a mother's love can indeed move mountains and reclaim kingdoms. If you enjoyed this story, if you believe in the unbreakable power of a true bond, please hit that like button and subscribe for more epic shifter romances. Share this with someone who needs to believe in happy endings and the strength that lies hidden within all of us.